Hello, I'm Leonardo Soto. I'm principal timpanist with the Houston Symphony, and I teach at the Frost School of Music at University of Miami, as well as the International Timpani Intensive. Today, I'm here to answer some of the basic timpani questions, whether you play in an orchestra, high school, or college, band, wind ensemble. I hope I can answer everything you need to know. I try to keep a system where they're not too tight and they're not too low. So when I lead the drums, I like to leave on the 32-inch drum a G, on the 29, a B natural, on the 26, an E flat, and on the 23 or 24, an E or an F. However, when the drums are going to be moved, if they need to be rolled or moved to another area, then it's important to bring them all the way up to the top, because you want to make sure that if they get bumped or anything, that nothing moves on top of it. You want to keep the heads steady. So if you put a little more pressure on them, even if they get bumped, the head is not going to come off center. However, once they arrive to their place, then make sure that you leave them on that pitch that I mentioned, so the head is not too tight and not too loose. It's important that students remember that when you play timpani, you use your hands a lot. You strike the instrument and then you mute with your hands. Whatever is in your hands, it gets stuck on the drum head. And just remember that when you strike the drum, everything that's on the head, it also goes to your sticks. So it's important that after you're done practicing or playing, always keep a towel and always wipe the heads off. Get all that grease or whatever is in your hands off of the drum head, and leave them at the proper tension so they will definitely last longer. I think it's ideal to have a full set of drums of the same brand. Maybe different sizes. There's many options of sizes, but having the same brand, it guarantees that you have the same height. Not every drum is made the same way, and if you have different materials, some kettles are made out of copper, some of them are made out of fiberglass. It's a different tone quality. There is different shapes of counter hoops that affects the sound as well. So keeping an even brand in the sense of tone quality is important, and in the sense of logistics, just make sure that the drums have the same height is very important as well, because that will affect the way you play, the way you move around the instrument. Timpani is a very physical instrument, and you have to do a lot of motion with your body, and if the heights are not the same, it's going to affect the way you play, the way you strike the drum, the angle, and obviously the sound that you produce. When you order new timpani heads, when you take the old drum head off, there is always a number that you can find on the side, whatever the brand is. It could be Remo or it could be Evans. There's a number on it. That's your reference number. There is several apps these days where there's one called actually Timpani Head, where you can put the brand of the instrument, the year, the type of heads that you want, and the brand of the drum head that you want, and it'll tell you exactly the number that you want to order. Because there's methods of measuring from the inside of the ball to the outside of the ball, but that's not always accurate if you don't precisely get it the way it needs to get done. So make sure that if that's the case, if you don't have a number, measure the old drum head from end to end and give them those measurements so they will know exactly what to build for you. On balance action timpani, if the drum is not holding pitch, meaning it's bouncing back or going forward, all it means is that the drum's out of range. So what you have to make sure you understand is what the range of each instrument is. Um, and if you are at the top of it and the note that it should go there is there, then the pedal is going to stay there. So with that, keeping in mind, the top note on a 32-inch drum, it should be a B. The top note on a 29, it should be a D. The top note on the 26 should be an F. And the top note on the 23 should be an A. If you make sure that those pitches are on the proper range, then the pedal will stay where it needs to stay. A good way to know if you need to change your drum head is bring the pressure all the way down, and you can see if there is any kind of stick marks on the drum head from being beat up. When has tension on, you can hardly see anything. If you bring it down when there is no tension, and you can see if it's being played out too much. That's the first sign. One of the most important signs to me in the orchestra is if I put the drums in the middle range and I strike the instrument and it's no longer holding pitch evenly, even after I clear the head, then it's time to change it. So always pay attention to the kind of resonance that is giving you when you first put fresh heads, and then the kind of resonance that gives you after a period of time of playing them. And notice if there is a decay on sound, and then see on the drum head if there is any wear as you play, especially with harder sticks. In the orchestra, the timpani normally gets placed in the middle, next to the trumpets, behind the horn, and the reason is, as a timpanist, you want to keep your your eyes not only on the conductor, but also on the concertmaster, on the principal bass, and your ears on everything that happens around here. If you are to the side, either side of the orchestra, it's harder to have, especially connection with the bass section, if you're on one end, or the concertmaster if you're on the other end. So I always prefer to place a timpani in the center, where you can have a very clear view. So you think more of chamber music rather than playing a part that belongs to something else. The timpani is part of a larger ensemble, and therefore it has to be placed where it needs to go, basically in the music. So if your placement is in the center, then you have a very clear vision of your colleagues. If you're playing on a brass band, then I'd like to stay always closer to the low end of the brass band. It's meaning tuba, bass, trombone, and next to the trumpet. If you look at the score, you realize where you're sharing your part with the most. Normally it's trumpets, and then whatever happens towards the end. So I would like to be towards the closer to the people that I mostly play with. So for the wind ensemble, it's a lot more similar to the orchestra, because for the wind ensemble, most of the arrangements, they have the woodwinds placed on the front where the violins would be, and so therefore you play kind of the same connection, the same yeah, relationships. So I will always place them in the middle. When you think about your fulcrum, the way you hold your sticks, which is what produces the sound, the first thing you have to remember is that whatever you do after, it should not affect the sound that you're producing. Meaning, don't cut your stroke short or make it harder just because you want to get to the muting of the drum. So make sure that the sound is the first point, and then you can cut off the sound. To cut off the sound, I like to keep my fulcrum, which in my case is the thumb and the index, and then I expand my fingers around it. So I'm not losing my actual fulcrum, so I can go right back to my grip. So I expand my fingers and I place them on top of the drum head. If I need to cut the sound immediately, then I will normally put them right where I struck the drum. If I play right there, that's where I'm gonna mute. That produces more contact sound, but it's more efficient. If I want to be a little more gentle about it, then if that's where I strike, then I go a little bit farther behind. There's still gonna be some ringing, but you don't hear so much of the contacts. So you have to figure out what sort of muting you need to do, how efficient you need it to be, and then find out where is the best part on the drum head to stop the sound. But most importantly, don't change your fulcrum, because if you change too much here, then it's hard to get back, especially with types of sticks that have the seam on. If you lose the side of that, then you might possibly end up playing with that, and that's what you want to avoid. So never lose your grip, just use your hand around it. Come back. Tuning gauges are very useful, very efficient. Most people can use some sort of device to place them. I prefer to use my ears, 100%. But if you want to use some sort of device to place them, it's okay. After that, you have to only use your ears. And if you have the fine tuners, use the fine tuners. Don't move the letters anymore, because whatever you hear today might be different than what you hear tomorrow. Whatever direction the orchestra is going today might be different than the direction that it's going tomorrow. What's more important is that you keep your feet on the pedals. I see a lot of timpanists these days putting their feet on some sort of rest on the timpani stool, and that not only messes with your balance, but you don't have the access to your pedals. Your feet should be always on the pedal of the drums that you're playing, so you can make the adjustments as you hear. The notes are set; they're not gonna move. You can use them, but make sure that if you need to make adjustments, you do it with your feet or the fine tuner. Once you get them set, I will say just leave them there, and from there on, just use your ears. If you play, for example, in the Houston Symphony, I use mostly calf heads for all subscription programs. That's a different story. And then plastic heads I will normally use for movies and pops concerts. And those get played more or less, um, I will say once a month, between subscription weeks, which means that I probably would change them every 6 months. If you're only playing on plastic heads and you're playing consistently, then I will say you probably need to change heads every 4 to 5 months. Depends on how much you're playing on them. For school situations, always depends on the budget, how much you can get for drum heads. So I will say at least once a year. It's ideal that you change them at least once a year, or preferably after every semester. Because if you're practicing on them and then you use them for concerts or recitals, they're going to get worn out. So if you can do them every semester, it will be fantastic. If you can do them once a year, it will be amazing. But try not to go any further than that. It's really important to understand that it doesn't have to be muted consistently, the timpani. It can ring. One important thing to remember about timpani ringing is that you do want to spend some time making sure that every tension rod has the same tension. And for that, use your ears. You can strike the drum and hear if there is any bend down or up on the pitch, and find which one of those logs is either too tight or too loose, and make those adjustments. Once you have a more steady um, pitch sustain, the drums are going to ring more evenly. Now, when do you mute them? You had to first of all understand what the context of the music is. Most instruments could have a shorter note, but the harmony keeps going on the same direction, and you can let the drum ring. The sound is going to decay on its own, but as long as you belong to the harmony, it's okay. If it's just ensemble playing with everybody's playing short, then you have to be aware of that, and then you play short. But no, don't ever play so short that you actually don't have time to hear the pitch. It's always important to let the ear hear the note and then mute. So don't try to always over mute too much and create too much contact sound, and not let the ear actually recognize what the notes are. So the famous American, I call it the American, I call it the international versus German. The reason why I call it international is because every place that I visit that use that system, they call it their own. The British call it the British way, and so I just decided to call it international. But the German setup is the traditional setup. If you look at the most traditional orchestras, Berlin Philharmonic, Vienna Philharmonic, Concertgebouw Orchestra, they all play on that setup. It comes from the original setup of timpani, which was meant as a call for war or hunting, and the drums were mounted on a horse. And typically, you mount the horse from the left side, so you had the bigger drum on the right side, and the smaller one on the left, so you can mount the horse. So if you look at these all war pictures, paintings, you always see timpani on top of a horse, and you'll see the bigger drum is on the right. The way I look at it, I play the German system because I've always said that timpani sort of belongs to the low end of the orchestra, meaning the bass section, the tuba, the bass trombone, and the basses are, you can call them German, because the low string is to the right, and so are the cellos. The lowest string is to the right. So I feel it's the same sort of setup. The other good reason for the German setup is if you are right-handed, you have to take in consideration how the drums project. High frequencies always travel fast. So the high end drum can be on my weaker hand, and it's always going to be heard. The middle drums are facing the audience, so the sound travels directly to them. But the low drum is facing on that direction, and it's low frequency, so it doesn't have the same support. So I'm leaving my stronger hand to deal with that. So overall, the sound is more equalized, it's more even. That's the one of the biggest reasons why a lot of people decide to play with the German setup. The international or American setup is mostly to match the low to high end of the keyboard, right? If you think of a piano or a marimba or vibraphone, it goes from low to high, so it sort of matches that setup, and most people decide to go in that direction. So there is not advantages or disadvantages. If you are a good musician, you're gonna figure out a way to make all four drums sound like one instrument, which is the ultimate goal, whether you play on this direction or in this direction. At the Houston Symphony, we have both. I play the German setup, and my colleague Matt Strauss, who's the assistant timpanist, he plays the international or the American setup. And we found that actually it works really well when we play symphonic pieces that require two timpanists, because I have my low drum here and he has his low drum there, so we actually meet and we find that it's very easy to communicate to each other when we're playing a Mahler symphony or Rite of Spring, because we're actually on our eyesight besides the conductor. So sometimes it's advantageous to have both within the same ensemble. Yeah, it does make sense if you think it from the perspective of bringing more energy to the low end. If you're left-handed, then it makes perfect sense that you have the low end, the low drum to your left. It's important to go back to the concept of what pitches do I get from each drum? What's the range of each drum, right? And that goes into understanding model of drums I'm playing, what make, and see what sounds the best. I always like to use the drums from the middle up. So let's say if I had to play a piece that requires G and C, if I put the G on the 29 and the C on the 26, they're both going to be on the very low end of the drums, which means that it's going to be harder when the drum head is too loose, it's going to be harder for the drum head to hold pitch. So I rethink it and I go, okay, I'm going to put the G on the 32 because it's right in the middle, and then the C on the 29 because it's on the upper register. Now I have a little bit more tension on the drum heads and a much more clear pitch. So when you look at your music, look at the notes and decide what note sounds best on what range of the drum. Many times I compare timpani to drum set, where you have things that you do with your hands and things that you do with your feet, and they had to be independent. When you practice your tuning, um, you should be able to move your feet in one motion to the next pitch as you go. So there is no glissando sound. If you move with a glissando sound, that's going to be heard, especially after you strike the drum. But you cannot let this motion affect the way you strike the drum. So if you're using certain type of strokes and all of a sudden you had to move your foot fast, then your strokes start to change. So you had to make sure that you can do this independently. So the sound consistency is always the same, but you're changing your pitch. Now, to practice this, I always recommend just play chromatic scales and then any scale going from the low drum to the high drum where you had to jump to the next pitch. At first, do it very slow. So on a quick motion, you get to the next notes, and then quick motion to the next note, and make sure that you hear the drum getting to that note. So you're not just training your feet, but also you're training your ear, and that also gives you a very clear understanding of how far you have to go to get to the next page, whether it's a half step or a whole step.